In Paris, in 1787, people stood in awe before a painting unlike anything they had ever seen, a canvas that brought together history, philosophy, politics, and art in a single frozen moment. This was The Death of Socrates, painted by Jacques-Louis David, a masterpiece that tells not only the story of the end of a great philosopher, but also the birth of a new style that shook all of France, a style later known as neoclassicism. The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David was completed in 1787 and is a model of the neoclassical movement in France, which David himself pioneered and brought to life. Before I say more, it's important to note how astonishing this painting is even without knowing anything about it. Much is revealed immediately. The clarity of the scene, the powerful gesture of the man in the center, the interaction between the cup and the reaching hand, the play of light, the men around, the soft folds of the clothing, and the bare, flat stone walls. As the title suggests, the painting depicts the death of Socrates, as described by Plato in his famous dialogue, Phaedo. Socrates was condemned in the Athenian court on charges of denying the city's gods and corrupting the youth. He was sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. As Plato explains in another dialogue, Crito, Socrates could have escaped into exile, but instead he chose death to seize the opportunity to give one final lesson, that death is not something a philosopher should fear, but rather a passage toward the divinization of the soul. David chooses to paint the decisive moment when Socrates reaches out to grasp the cup of poison. He had been speaking at length about the immortality of the soul, and he does not seem at all concerned by the fact that he is about to carry out his own execution. On the contrary, Socrates appears to advance eagerly toward what lies beyond life. David paints him as an idealized figure. Socrates should have been 70 years old at the time, and by accounts not handsome nor muscular, yet here he is rendered with a striking, vigorous body. A strong light, streaming from the upper left, pours over Socrates, making him the brightest figure in the scene. The muted colors at the edges come alive in the center, with the executioner in red and Socrates in white. For David, Socrates symbolizes the triumph of reason over desire, and a steadfast devotion to principle even in the face of death. This was the moral message David sought to convey to the French people 2 years before the French Revolution, at a time when monarchy was declining and reformers sought to prove the strength of democracy, just as in ancient Athens or in the United States, which had completed its revolution only 5 years earlier. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself was present at the unveiling of this painting at the 1787 Salon. The image, which captivated the attention of 2 radical reformist statesmen, soon became famous. By then, David had already made a name for himself with another painting of strict moral gravity, The Oath of the Horatii. The neoclassical movement, which was effectively created by David, drew its features from the severe simplicity of ancient Greece and Rome, from the classical obsession with the human body and musculature, and from freezing historical events into 2-dimensional scenes. Neoclassicism, as presented by David, reveals its features with force and severity. This was in direct opposition to the Rococo style then dominant, which reflected ornamentation and the luxurious lifestyle of the monarchy. In The Oath of the Horatii, as in The Death of Socrates, those who devote themselves to a principle are depicted with geometric clarity, while those ruled by emotion are shown bent, weak, and fragile. In both works, the background is flattened to focus attention on the foreground, where the actions can be read clearly from one side to the other. One way to read The Death of Socrates is from right to left. The suffering of Socrates' followers writhing in grief opens onto the calm expression of Socrates himself and leads toward his right hand hovering over the poisoned cup. The small gap between hand and cup, placed exactly in the center of the painting, represents the peak of tension reflected in the anguish of the man offering the poison, who turns his gaze away from Socrates. Finally, there is the man sitting at the edge of the bed, not intervening, to whom we shall return shortly. David does not explicitly identify anyone in the painting, but we can infer from the historical accounts of Socrates' death that the woman in the background is his wife, Xanthippe, standing apart in sorrow, while the one holding his leg is Crito, one of his earliest and most faithful disciples. We can also see that David signed his name beneath Crito, suggesting a personal identification with him. David himself was weaker than the moral ideal he painted, yet he strove toward it with determination. The painter also drew on other historical sources. Besides altering Socrates' face and posture, David reduced the number of figures present at the event from more than 15 to 12, aligning it with the number of disciples in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. But I believe the most significant change is the inclusion of the figure at the edge of the bed. This is Plato, the man who made Socrates' lessons and teachings famous, portraying him as the hero in more than 30 philosophical dialogues. Quite simply, without Plato, there would be no Socrates. The two men blend into each other historically. It is difficult to say where Socratic philosophy ends and Platonic philosophy begins. Plato was not only absent at Socrates' actual death, but at the time, he was still a young man. Yet David paints him here as old and withdrawn. As I mentioned earlier, one can read the painting from right to left, but also from left to right. Seen that way, the entire scene seems to burst forth from Plato's head, reforming itself as memory, a perfected memory, in which Socrates gestures exactly as he does in Raphael's School of Athens. Plato is placed far from the flat background, as though the frozen moment of the scene extends into the depths of time and reality. I find it remarkable how memory often appears to us in this way, represented in smooth contours, perfect light, two-dimensional harmony, meticulously arranged to serve the needs of the present. In Plato's figure, the moral severity of the scene is betrayed, subtly reshaped by the act of recollection itself. And years later, the revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution would likewise be betrayed by the terrifying reality that followed. Perhaps this is why David signs his name again here almost prophetically. Neoclassicism may seem strict and blunt, but in David's death of Socrates so much is happening. A convergence of historical, personal, political, and aesthetic elements, delivered with power, skill, and beauty. In other words, it is a work of genius. And so, the painting The Death of Socrates remains more than just an artistic scene. It is an eternal message of strength and faith in principles. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of history and art, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss anything new.